The checkpoint sits at the edge of Marseille, January 1943, just past midnight. Temperature hovers at 3 degrees Celsius. Frost creeps across the wooden barrier that blocks the road south. 2 Gestapo officers stamp their feet against the cold, breath visible in the beam of their flashlights. Behind them, 4 Wehrmacht soldiers wait with rifles unslung. They have been at this checkpoint for 6 hours. They are cold. They are bored. They are hunting the most dangerous woman in France. They do not know she is already here. A black Citroën approaches from the north. Its headlights cut through the winter fog like searchlights through smoke. The lead Gestapo officer, Obersturmführer Klaus Reinhardt, steps into the road with his hand raised. He has made this gesture 300 times in the past month. Usually it means nothing. Farmers, merchants, people trying to survive. But tonight feels different. Tonight his instincts whisper warnings he cannot articulate. The car stops. The driver's window rolls down. A woman leans out, mid-30s, dark hair, red lipstick that looks black in the flashlight beam. She smiles. She is annoyed at being stopped, but trying to hide it. She is very good at hiding things. What she cannot hide, she transforms into something useful. Right now, her annoyance is camouflage. Reinhardt asks for papers. The woman produces them from a leather purse without hesitation. French identity card. Travel permit signed by a German liaison officer. A letter authorizing her passage. Everything is in order. Everything is always in order when the White Mouse travels. That is the problem. Perfection itself is suspicious. Reinhardt has learned that innocent people make mistakes. Their papers have coffee stains. Their signatures smudge. Their stories contain small contradictions because truth is messy. This woman's papers are immaculate. He checks the photograph against her face. It matches. He checks the signature against known forgeries. It appears genuine. He walks to the back of the vehicle and opens the trunk. Luggage. Women's clothing. A bottle of expensive perfume that probably cost more than his monthly salary. Nothing suspicious. Nothing except the feeling in his stomach that refuses to quiet. Where are you traveling? His French is adequate but mechanical. Each word a translation rather than natural speech. Toulouse, my aunt is dying. The woman's French is perfect, native. She touches her temple as if she has a headache. I received the telegram this afternoon. I've been driving since sunset. Reinhardt studies her. The headache gesture is good, natural, the kind of detail liars forget to include, but something about the way she holds herself bothers him. She is worried about her aunt. She is tired from driving. She is cold. All of this shows in her posture and expression. Yet underneath, he senses something else, a calculation happening behind her eyes, an awareness of angles and distances and exit routes. Or perhaps he is simply tired himself, seeing threats in every shadow. Wait here, Reinhardt says. He walks to his partner and speaks in German. Something about her bothers me. The papers are good. Too good. Check the list. His partner retrieves a leather folder from inside the guard station. Inside are photographs and descriptions of wanted persons. Resistance fighters, British agents, Jews attempting to reach Spain, communist organizers, black market operators. At the top of the list, marked with a red star indicating highest priority, is a woman the Gestapo calls Die Weiße Maus, the White Mouse. They do not have a photograph. They have conflicting descriptions compiled from interrogations, informant reports, and surveillance failures. Some reports say she is blonde, others say dark-haired, tall, average height, thin, athletic, in her 20s, in her 30s. The only consistent detail is that she is clever, dangerously clever. She has escaped 11 Gestapo raids. She has smuggled over 1,000 Allied airmen out of France. The bounty on her head is 5 million francs. The list provides no useful information. It never does. The White Mouse is a ghost who changes appearance like other women change dresses. Reinhardt returns to the Citroën. The woman has lit a cigarette. She offers him one. He declines. He asks her to step out of the vehicle. She does smoothly, as if this happens every night, as if checkpoints are tedious interruptions rather than life or death interrogations. She is wearing an expensive coat. Perfume reaches him even in the cold air. She looks at him with mild curiosity, as if wondering what else he could possibly need to verify. "You travel alone at night?" "My husband is in Lyon on business. I couldn't wait. She might not last the week." "What is your husband's name?" "Jean-Paul Mercier. He works in textiles." "You can verify this?" She reaches into her purse. Reinhardt's hand moves to his pistol. She removes a business card and hands it to him. Her hands do not shake. Her breathing remains steady. The card is embossed, professional, expensive. Everything about this woman speaks of privilege and boredom and minor inconveniences. Everything checks, and that is exactly what troubles him. The White Mouse would check too. That is how she survives. Reinhardt makes a decision. "You will follow us to headquarters. We need to verify your story." For the first time, the woman's expression changes. Not panic, concern. The appropriate amount for someone whose dying aunt is waiting in Toulouse. "Of course. How long will this take? My aunt." "As long as necessary." What Reinhardt does not know is that the woman standing in front of him has already calculated 17 different ways to escape this situation. While he was checking her trunk, she was counting the rifles and noting which soldiers looked alert and which looked cold and tired. While he was walking to his partner, she was measuring the distance to her car door and running probability calculations in her mind. She knows these roads. She has memorized them the way a pianist memorizes scales. The Citroën's engine is still running. 3 steps to the door, 5 seconds to accelerate beyond rifle range in the fog. 70% chance of escape if she moves now. 90% if she waits for a distraction. She does not need to wait long. Behind the checkpoint, one of the Wehrmacht soldiers calls out. He has found something in the ditch, a package wrapped in cloth. The soldiers converge on it, rifles ready, thinking mines or grenades or partisan traps. Reinhardt turns. His attention shifts for exactly 4 seconds. Nancy Wake moves. She slides into the Citroën with the speed of someone who has rehearsed the motion 100 times in her mind. She slams the door. She shifts into reverse. The engine roars. Reinhardt spins back toward her, but she is already accelerating backward into the darkness. Taillights disappearing into fog like blood dissolving in water. The soldiers raise their rifles. Someone shouts to hold fire. Someone else ignores the order. Bullets punch through winter air. One catches the rear window and spiders the glass. Another ricochets off the trunk with a sound like a hammer on sheet metal. Nancy shifts into second gear and turns onto a side road without touching the brakes. Her headlights stay off. She knows these roads. She has driven them in darkness so many times that the curves and intersections exist in her muscle memory. The Gestapo will search for her. They will flood Marseille with checkpoints. They will interrogate everyone at the Hotel du Louvre where her false identity has a reservation. They will find nothing because Nancy Wake has already discarded that identity like a snake shedding skin. The White Mouse has escaped again, and they still do not know what she looks like. Behind her, Reinhardt stands at the checkpoint watching fog swallow the road. The package in the ditch was nothing. Rags wrapped around a stone, a distraction, possibly coincidence, possibly orchestrated. He will never know. What he does know is that the woman in the black Citroën was not traveling to see a dying aunt. The way she moved, the precision of her timing, the absolute lack of panic, these things reveal training or experience that no civilian possesses. Reinhardt files a report that night. He describes the encounter in detail. He notes that the woman may be connected to resistance activities. He does not suggest she is the White Mouse because that would be admitting he let the Gestapo's most wanted person slip through his hands. His career would end. So he describes her as a person of interest. The report joins thousands of others. And Nancy Wake continues to move through occupied France like smoke through cracks. But something has changed. The net is tightening, and Nancy knows it. To understand how one woman could become the Gestapo's most wanted person, you need to understand the machine hunting her. And you need to understand that Nancy Wake was never supposed to be the person who destroyed it. By 1943, the German occupation had transformed France into a surveillance state. The Gestapo operated 42 regional headquarters across occupied territory. Each headquarters was a spider at the center of a web. They tapped telephones, they monitored train stations, they controlled ration registries and hotel logs. They employed over 30,000 agents, informants, and collaborators. They had eyes everywhere. They had files on everyone. Moving through occupied France without papers was suicide. Moving with papers meant creating a trail. The Germans owned both options. Against this machinery stood the French resistance. They were not soldiers. They were teachers and farmers and shopkeepers who had decided that submission was worse than death. They had minimal training. They had scarce weapons. They had no central command. They operated in isolated cells. Never knowing if the person beside them was a comrade or an informant, the Gestapo hunted them with industrial efficiency. In 1943 alone, German forces arrested over 90,000 resistance suspects. 30,000 were executed, 20,000 died in concentration camps. The rest simply disappeared into a system designed to erase them. The statistics were clear. Resistance was suicide. Fighting was pointless. The Germans had won. Nancy Wake disagreed. The British Special Operations Executive tried to help. They parachuted trained agents into occupied territory to coordinate resistance efforts and gather intelligence. The agents were brave. They were skilled. They died quickly. The Gestapo had infiltrated resistance networks. They intercepted radio transmissions. They tortured captured agents until information flowed like water. The average life expectancy of an SOE agent operating in France was 6 months. Some lasted weeks. A few survived. Most became names on casualty lists that London tried not to think about. The Germans called Nancy Wake Die Weiße Maus, the white mouse. They did not use the term with affection. They used it with the kind of frustration that keeps interrogators awake at night. By 1944, the bounty on her head reached 5 million francs. To put this in perspective, the bounty for capturing any other Allied agent was 50,000 francs. Nancy's bounty was 100 times higher. This made her more valuable to the Gestapo than saboteurs, assassins, or radio operators. They wanted her captured. They wanted her questioned. They wanted to understand how one person could coordinate escape networks, gather intelligence, and vanish before they could close their hands around her. The answer was simple. Nancy Wake understood something the Germans did not. She understood that the best weapon is the one your enemy refuses to see as a threat. And in 1940s occupied France, a wealthy socialite with red lipstick and champagne connections was not a threat. She was furniture, background noise, decorative and harmless. Nancy used this blindness to destroy them. This is the story of Nancy Wake, but it does not begin with heroism. It begins with a girl who refused to follow rules and a young woman who accidentally witnessed evil. She was born in Wellington, New Zealand on August 30th, 1912. The Gestapo would later list her birthplace as unknown in their files. They had most things about her wrong. Her family moved to Sydney, Australia when she was 2. Her father worked sporadically. Her mother raised 6 children with determination that her youngest daughter would describe decades later as tyrannical. Nancy did not fit. She asked questions that annoyed teachers. She challenged expectations. She left home at 16 with 200 pounds inherited from an aunt and a clear understanding that the world her mother wanted for her, marriage, children, obedience, was not the world she intended to inhabit. She worked as a nurse in Sydney. She saved money the way people save for escape. At 20, she bought a ticket to London and then to Paris. She wanted to see the world. She wanted freedom. She wanted a life larger than the one prescribed for young women whose primary value was looking pretty and saying yes. Paris in the 1930s was the center of everything that mattered: art, fashion, politics, revolution. Nancy found work as a freelance journalist. She was 5 feet 7 inches tall, dark-haired, striking rather than classically beautiful. She had a sharp wit and the kind of confidence that came from having already left one life behind. She spoke English and French fluently. She learned to move through Paris society with the ease of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere. She covered fashion shows. She interviewed artists. She attended parties where champagne flowed and conversation sparkled with ideas that would be illegal 5 years later. She was, by all accounts, exactly what she appeared to be: a young woman enjoying the most sophisticated city in Europe. Then Vienna happened. In 1937, Nancy traveled to Austria on assignment. She was there to cover fashion. She witnessed Nazi brown shirts dragging Jewish families from their homes instead. She saw men beaten in the street while crowds watched or looked away or applauded. She saw an old woman forced to scrub sidewalks with a toothbrush while SA troops laughed and took photographs. the images seared into her memory, with the kind of permanence that changes everything that comes after. She returned to Paris understanding that war was coming. More importantly, she understood that the comfortable world of cafes and cocktails was built on foundations already cracking. Evil was not abstract. It was men in uniforms beating grandmothers for entertainment. She could not forget what she had seen. She tried. Paris made it easy to try, but the images remained. In 1939, Nancy married Henri Fiocca, a wealthy French industrialist 14 years her senior. Henri was gentle, cultured, deeply in love with this Australian woman who had burst into his organized life like summer lightning. They lived in an apartment in Marseille overlooking the Mediterranean. Nancy hosted dinner parties. She wore designer gowns by Chanel and Schiaparelli. She collected art. She was, to outside observers, a wealthy socialite whose greatest concern was which restaurant to book for Saturday evening. Henri adored her. She loved him with the kind of certainty that made the future feel simple. Then Germany invaded France, May 1940. The Wehrmacht crashed through French defenses in 6 weeks. The speed of collapse was shocking. The scale was humiliating. German tanks rolled down the Champs-Élysées, while French citizens wept or cheered or simply watched in numb disbelief. France, the nation that had withstood 4 years of trench warfare in the previous war, had fallen faster than Poland. The armistice was signed. The occupation began. German soldiers patrolled French streets. Swastika flags hung from French government buildings. The world had changed, and Nancy Wake made a decision that would cost her everything. She would fight. She did not announce this decision. She did not discuss it with Henri. She simply began. Small actions. A British pilot shot down near Marseille needed civilian clothes. Nancy provided them. An Australian soldier separated from his unit needed food and a place to hide. Nancy found both. Word spread quietly through underground networks. If you needed help crossing into Spain, there was a woman in Marseille who could arrange it. She was charming. She was connected. She spoke English. She could be trusted. Nancy turned her social connections into an escape network. She used Henri's wealth to bribe border guards. She hid fugitives in her apartment, explaining to Henri that these were friends, business associates, people down on their luck who needed help. Henri asked no questions. He knew his wife. He understood that arguing with Nancy was like arguing with the tide. She drove fugitives south in his car, talking past Gestapo checkpoints with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. And for months it worked. But Nancy was not naive. She knew the risks. She studied the Germans the way a hunter studies prey. She memorized their procedures. She learned which checkpoints were staffed by lazy soldiers looking forward to their shift ending, and which were staffed by zealots hunting for the smallest irregularity. She learned that expensive perfume and elegant clothes created a cognitive dissonance in the minds of checkpoint guards. Terrorists were supposed to look like terrorists. This woman looked like she belonged at opera openings. The contradiction created hesitation. Hesitation created opportunity. Opportunity created escape routes that saved lives. The French resistance called this quality débrouillardise, the art of making do, of solving impossible problems with whatever tools are available. Nancy had it in abundance. She was not trained in espionage. She had not attended spy school. She was a journalist who had learned to talk to anyone, and a society woman who had learned which smiles opened which doors. She was also a person who had decided that sitting safely while others suffered was not an option she could accept. She did not know it yet, but this combination would make her more dangerous than a dozen trained agents. Because Nancy Wake understood something that no training manual taught. The best disguise is being exactly who people expect you to be. And in occupied France, nobody expected danger from a woman in Chanel drinking champagne at the Hôtel de Louvre. The Germans were about to learn otherwise, when British intelligence offered Nancy a position as a simple courier for the resistance, carrying messages between cells in Marseille. She listened politely and then made her own plans. She understood that her greatest weapons were the very things the Gestapo would dismiss as weaknesses, and she intended to use them with precision that would make trained operatives look clumsy. Her first weapon was invisible. It was femininity in a war zone where femininity meant harmlessness. Gestapo officers expected terrorists to look like terrorists. They had psychological profiles, behavioral patterns, demographic indicators. Their training taught them to watch for nervous men with working-class clothes and rough hands, for people who avoided eye contact or sweated under questioning, for inconsistencies in stories and trembling hands when producing papers. Nowhere in their extensive training did it suggest that the woman in the expensive coat laughing at a cafe, the one who flirted with German officers and complained about rationed silk stockings, could be moving intelligence that would kill their soldiers. Nancy understood this blindness and weaponized it. She dressed elegantly. She wore makeup even when bombs fell on Marseille. She carried herself with the casual arrogance of privilege, the kind of arrogance that came naturally to people who had never feared anything worse than a bad table at a restaurant. When she approached checkpoints, she was not a suspect. She was an inconvenience, a pretty distraction in a job that was mostly tedious. Guards checked her papers with half their attention, while the other half appreciated her perfume and her smile and the way her voice sounded when she laughed at their broken French. They waved her through. They never searched her car thoroughly enough. They certainly never imagined she had forged documents sewn into her coat lining, or that she had memorized the locations of every German patrol between Marseille and the Spanish border, or that the makeup compact in her purse contained microfilm with Allied intelligence. She hid nothing. She simply appeared too visible to be dangerous. Her second weapon was charm, that disarmed suspicion before it could take root. While male agents were hunted on sight if they said the wrong thing or hesitated at the wrong moment, Nancy could make Gestapo officers laugh. She mastered the art of the strategic complaint. She complained about the occupation the way wealthy French women complained about everything, with theatrical exasperation that was more performance than threat. She accepted lights for her cigarettes from SS officers and used those 30 seconds to observe which roads they were watching, which documents they were checking, what patterns their patrols followed. She gathered intelligence while appearing to do nothing more than tolerate an inconvenient delay. Her charm was not manipulation in the crude sense. It was something more sophisticated. She made people feel at ease. She made them feel clever and important. She made them want to help her. And by the time they realized they had been compromised, she was already gone, and their reports sounded paranoid. The woman in the red dress could not possibly be a spy. She had been delightful. She had smiled. Spies did not smile like that. The Gestapo's own assumptions became Nancy's best protection. Her third weapon was access that would have been impossible for working-class resistors. Henri's business connections meant invitations to dinners where German officers attended. Nancy went. She listened. She cataloged which Wehrmacht units were stationed where, which commanders were competent and which were drunk on their own power, what the Germans feared and what they dismissed. She heard them complain about sabotaged rail lines, about missing supply shipments, about invisible enemies who struck and vanished. She carried this intelligence back to the resistance in conversations that appeared to be nothing more than gossip between society women. Her champagne connections, the very things that would have made ideological resistors distrust her, allowed her to move through occupied France like smoke through cracks. She belonged at parties and checkpoints and expensive hotels. No one questioned her presence because people like Nancy Wake were not supposed to be dangerous. They were supposed to be decorative, harmless, forgettable. Nancy was none of these things. This was genius not because it was complex, but because it was counterintuitive. Traditional espionage taught invisibility, blend in, become gray, disappear. Nancy did the opposite. She became hypervisible. She was memorable in all the wrong ways. Gestapo officers remembered the woman with red lipstick who complained about weak coffee, not the woman who was coordinating an escape network that had already smuggled over 100 Allied servicemen to safety. By the time they realized these were the same person, Nancy had adapted her methods, changed her appearance, shifted her base of operations. She was always 3 steps ahead because she understood something the Germans did not. The best place to hide is in plain sight, and the best weapon is the one your enemy refuses to see as a threat. The resistance would later document an extraordinary statistic. While male operatives were being captured and executed at devastating rates, the average survival time was 6 months. Nancy made crossing after crossing, contact after contact, checkpoint after checkpoint. She was never detained for more than an hour. She was never seriously questioned. She moved weapons, intelligence, and fugitives across France with a success rate that verged on the impossible. When SOE officers in London reviewed her file, they reached a conclusion that would have been laughable if it were not absolutely documented. This untrained Australian socialite was better at field operations than agents who had spent months learning tradecraft. She was not just surviving in occupied France, she was thriving, and the Gestapo was starting to notice. Interrogation reports from captured resistance members began mentioning a woman in Marseille. Descriptions were inconsistent: blonde, brunette, tall, average, young, mature, but the results were consistent. Allied personnel were escaping. Safe houses were never raided. Intelligence was flowing to London. And somewhere in Marseille, a woman was orchestrating it all. The Gestapo gave her a code name: Die Weiße Maus, the white mouse. Small, quick, impossible to catch. They intended it as operational designation. It became something else. It became frustration given form. Because every time they closed the trap, the white mouse had already escaped. Every time they thought they had identified her, they found someone else. Every time they raided a safe house, they found abandoned apartments and cold coffee cups and the ghost of a woman who refused to be caught. Nancy Wake was not just surviving, she was winning, and the Germans were about to commit significant resources to making sure that stopped. On the morning of November 12, 1942, Nancy faced her first real test. Not because it was her first operation. She had already completed 17 successful extractions, but this was the first time the Gestapo had been waiting. The operation was routine by her standards. A British bomber crew, 4 men, all in their 20s, all exhausted and frightened, had been shot down near Toulouse 3 days earlier. They were hiding in a farmhouse 40 kilometers north of Marseille. Nancy's job was to move them south to a safe house, provide forged papers, and arrange their crossing into Spain. Simple. She had done it 17 times. She did not expect the 18th to be different. She was wrong. Nancy drove Henri's Peugeot north through autumn fog that morning. The fog was thick enough to taste, cold and damp, the kind that made visibility drop to 30 meters. She liked fog. It made checkpoints slower. It made soldiers less careful. It gave her options if things went wrong. She did not know that things were already wrong. She did not know that the farmer hiding the airmen was a paid informant. She did not know that 60 German soldiers were already in position around the farmhouse, waiting for whoever came to collect the fugitives. The Gestapo had set a perfect trap. All they needed was for the white mouse to walk into it. Nancy arrived at 10:15. She parked on the dirt road 50 meters from the farmhouse and walked the rest of the way. She carried a basket with bread, cheese, and women's clothing that the airmen would use for their journey south. Professional, prepared, confident. She knocked on the farmhouse door 3 times, paused, knocked twice more. The coded knock. The door opened immediately. The farmer's wife gestured her inside with movements that were too quick, too nervous. Nancy's instincts screamed warnings. The kitchen smelled of coffee and fear. The 4 British airmen sat at a wooden table trying to look calm. They were young, early 20s, exhausted, frightened but trying not to show it. Nancy smiled and spoke English quietly. "We'll leave in 20 minutes. Change into these clothes. Don't speak unless I speak to you first. If we're stopped, you're French workers heading to Marseille for factory jobs. I'll do the talking. Everything will be fine." The pilot, a sergeant named James Crawford, nodded. "Are we safe here?" Nancy was about to answer when she heard it. A truck engine, then another. Close. Too close. She moved to the window. Wehrmacht troop trucks were coming up the road from both directions. Soldiers spilling out like ants from a disturbed nest. Rifles ready. Officers shouting orders in German. The farmer's wife gasped, and Nancy understood everything instantly. Betrayal. The entire operation was a trap. She had perhaps 90 seconds before German soldiers surrounded the farmhouse. The airmen reached for weapons they didn't have. Nancy's mind moved through options with the speed that would later make her legendary. They could not fight 60 soldiers. They could not surrender. The airmen would be sent to POW camps. Nancy would be tortured and executed. They could not run. The Germans had surrounded the building. Standard resistance protocol was suicide. Nancy rejected standard protocol. "The cellar," she said. "Now, move." The farmer's wife was already moving, pulling open a trap door hidden beneath a rug. The Germans had not searched thoroughly because the informant had not mentioned a cellar. Information gaps become survival opportunities if you move fast enough. Nancy pushed the airmen toward the opening. They descended into darkness that smelled of earth and potatoes. The space was not large enough for 5 people to stand comfortably. They would manage because managing was not optional. Nancy followed them down and pulled the door shut above them. Darkness complete. She could hear the airmen breathing, could hear her own heart beating, could hear boots on the floor above, German voices, loud, aggressive. The farmer's voice nervous, saying yes. A woman came, yes. British airmen, they were here just minutes ago, but they escaped through the back before he could stop them. Nancy realized the farmer was not a complete informant. He was a coward trying to satisfy both sides. He was telling the Germans enough to save himself, but not enough to kill his wife. It was pathetic, and it might save their lives. The soldiers searched the house. Nancy tracked their movements by sound: kitchen, living room, bedrooms, attic. They were methodical, but not thorough. They expected the fugitives to have run. They searched for signs of ambush or a rear exit. They did not search for a cellar because the informant had not mentioned one, and German soldiers followed procedures. Procedures did not include checking for hidden cellars in every farmhouse. 12 minutes. The longest 12 minutes of Nancy's life to that point. Then the soldiers left. Truck engines started. Orders were shouted. The sound faded. Nancy counted to 300. Then she counted again. She waited until the truck engines had faded into silence, and the only sound was her own breathing. Only then did she push open the trap door. The farmer was gone. His wife remained, crying silently at the kitchen table. Nancy did not waste time on accusations or comfort. She gathered the airmen and led them out the back of the farmhouse into dense forest. They moved cross-country for 6 hours, avoiding roads, avoiding villages, avoiding anything that looked like civilization. Nancy navigated by instinct and memory. She had studied maps until she could reproduce them from memory. She knew these hills better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. By nightfall, they reached a hunting cabin owned by one of Henri's business associates. The cabin was cold and empty and safe. Nancy left the airmen there with food and instructions to stay hidden for 3 days. She would send someone to move them south. She returned to Marseille alone, driving through darkness with her headlights off because that was the only way to avoid checkpoints that would be searching for a woman matching her description. When she arrived home at 3 a.m, Henri was waiting. He looked older than he had that morning. He knew where Nancy had been. He knew what she was doing. He never questioned her. He never asked her to stop. He simply stood and held her while she shook with adrenaline and exhaustion and the understanding that she had been 90 seconds from capture. The 4 British airmen reached Spain 11 days later. They would return to England and fly again. The Gestapo filed a report noting that an unidentified woman had assisted enemy personnel to escape. They increased patrols. They offered rewards for information. They added another note to the growing file on the White Mouse. But they still did not know her name. Nancy had passed her first real test. She had walked into a trap and walked out again. And in doing so, she had crossed a line. She was no longer a civilian helping where she could. She was an operative. She was good at this. Frighteningly good. And the Germans would soon learn to fear the name they had given her, the White Mouse. Word spread through underground channels faster than radio transmissions. The escape was discussed in hushed conversations in Lyon, Paris, Toulouse. Resistance cells compared notes. There was a woman in Marseille who could move people past German lines. She was efficient. She was daring. She did not fail. Her network grew. More fugitives, more intelligence, more risk. By early 1943, Nancy had personally helped over 500 Allied personnel escape to Spain. The Gestapo began to realize that their impossible fugitive was not multiple people operating under one codename. It was one person, one woman. And they wanted her more than they wanted saboteurs or assassins or spies, because Nancy Wake represented something more dangerous than violence. She represented hope, and hope was the one thing the occupation could not tolerate. The bounty on her head increased. 50,000 francs, 100,000, 500,000. The numbers climbed with Gestapo frustration, and still the White Mouse escaped. But the net was tightening, and Nancy knew it. She could feel it in the way checkpoint guards studied her papers more carefully, in the way informants watched her at cafes, in the way the Gestapo was asking questions about Henry's business, about their apartment, about the Australian woman with too many unexplained absences. Something would have to change. The question was whether Nancy would change it first, or whether the Gestapo would change it for her. The operations came faster after that, each one ratcheting tension higher, each one testing the limits of what was possible. On January 8, 1943, Nancy moved 6 American airmen south through Toulouse. The Americans were conspicuous in ways the British never were. They were tall. They were loud. They had trouble staying quiet even when silence was survival. Nancy dressed them in workers' clothes and had them carry toolboxes as if they were traveling electricians. At a checkpoint near Carcassonne, a Gestapo officer asked one of the Americans for his papers. The American handed them over without speaking. Good, he was learning. The officer studied the documents. Nancy saw the moment the officer's expression shifted from bored routine to suspicious interest. He was about to ask a question. Questions were death for Americans who barely spoke French. Nancy intervened. She stepped between them with a complaint about the checkpoint delaying urgent repair work at a factory in Perpignan. She spoke rapid French, frustrated and impatient. The officer tried to ask the American a question. Nancy kept talking, overwhelming him with details about deadlines and German factory managers who would be furious about delays. And didn't the officer understand that the Reich needed this electrical work completed today? Not tomorrow, today. And if there were problems, she would be reporting this checkpoint number to her German contacts in Marseille. The officer, exhausted by her relentless chatter and the implied threat of complaints to his superiors, waved them through. The Americans reached Spain 4 days later. They had not spoken a word of French the entire journey. They did not need to. Nancy had spoken enough for all of them. On February 3rd, Nancy drove an injured British officer across 4 checkpoints with a man bleeding in her trunk. She had sedated him with morphine stolen from a hospital and packed his wound with cloth torn from bedsheets. At each checkpoint, she complained about a persistent knocking sound from the trunk. She blamed it on a loose jack. She promised to have it repaired in Marseille. She was annoyed. She was running late. She had places to be. None of the guards looked closely enough to see the blood seeping through the trunk liner. The officer survived. He would return to England, recover, and fly 23 more missions before the war ended. He would name his daughter Nancy and never tell her why until she was old enough to understand. On March 17th, everything accelerated toward catastrophe. The Gestapo raided Nancy's apartment in Marseille. She was not home. She was meeting contacts at a cafe across the city, coordinating a supply drop of forged ration cards. Henry was home. They took him. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. They destroyed furniture looking for hidden radios or documents. They found nothing because Nancy kept nothing incriminating in the apartment. Henry told them his wife was a socialite with no interest in politics. He showed them photographs of dinner parties and vacation trips to Nice. He was convincing because he was partially telling the truth. Nancy had hidden her resistance work even from him in the early days, telling him only that she was helping people cross borders, not mentioning the scale or the danger or the fact that the Gestapo had put a price on her head. By the time Henry understood the full scope of her activities, he loved her too much to interfere. He understood her. She had witnessed evil in Vienna. She could not look away. Fighting was not a choice for Nancy. It was who she was. The Gestapo left after 6 hours. They put Henri under surveillance. They tapped his telephone. They opened his mail. They followed him to work and back home. They waited for Nancy to contact him, to make a mistake, to give them the opening they needed. Nancy did not make mistakes. She adapted. She stopped returning to the apartment. She moved between safe houses, never staying more than 2 nights in one location. She cut her hair short. She changed her style of dress from elegant to working class, and back again, depending on what the operation required. She became a brunette, then a redhead, then returned to dark brown. She wore glasses that changed the shape of her face. She developed a limp that disappeared when she left the street. She became whatever the situation required. The Gestapo had extensive files on Nancy Wake, but no reliable photograph. Every description contradicted the last. She was tall, she was average height, She was thin, she was athletic, she was elegant, she was plain. Every witness saw something different because Nancy showed them what they expected to see. But the surveillance on Henri was a problem. Nancy could not contact him, could not let him know she was safe, could not risk leading the Gestapo to her current locations. She watched him from a distance twice, once at his office building, once outside their apartment. He looked tired, older. She wanted to go to him. Her network physically restrained her from this stupidity. Going to Henri meant capture. Capture meant the destruction of an escape line that was saving lives weekly. In April 1943, the Gestapo closed the net tighter. They had traced Nancy's network through tortured resistance members. They knew she operated from Marseille. They knew her real name. They knew she was married to Henri Fiocca. They raided the apartment again on April 20th. This time, they took Henri to headquarters on Rue Paradis, the building where screams went unheard and questions were asked with electricity and pliers and methods that left no marks. They wanted Nancy's location. They wanted names of her contacts. They wanted her operational procedures. They wanted everything. Henri told them nothing. They beat him. He told them nothing. They tortured him with techniques perfected in Gestapo training schools. He told them nothing. After 3 days, they released him because dead husbands could not lead them to their wives, and Henri Fiocca clearly did not know where Nancy was. Which was truth. Nancy had protected him by keeping him ignorant of details that could be tortured out of him. Nancy learned of Henri's arrest from a contact in the police. She wanted to go to him immediately. Her network held a meeting. They explained calmly that going to Henri meant capture and execution. Nancy knew this. She had always known this. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are different things. She made the calculation that every operative eventually faces. She chose the mission over the person she loved. She did not see Henri again. She left Marseille on April 24th, traveling through an escape route she had used dozens of times to save others. Now, she was using it to save herself. She felt like a coward. Her network told her she was being practical. Both things were true. She crossed the Pyrenees on foot in early May. The journey took 6 days. She traveled with a guide and 2 other refugees. They climbed through snow and darkness. They had minimal food. Nancy's feet blistered and bled through her boots. She did not complain. Complaining wasted energy. She reached Spain on May 5, 1943. From Spain, she made her way to England through diplomatic channels. She arrived in London on May 20th, weighing 40 pounds less than when she had left France. She reported immediately to SOE headquarters at 64 Baker Street. She told them she wanted training. She told them she wanted to return to France. She told them she would kill every German she could reach. They believed her. They had never seen determination quite like hers. The SOE trained Nancy at finishing schools scattered across England and Scotland. She learned parachute jumps at Ringway, weapons handling at Arisaig, hand-to-hand combat from instructors who had trained commandos, demolitions, radio operation, advanced tradecraft, security procedures, how to resist interrogation, how to kill silently. Her instructors noted that she was a natural. She was fearless in training jumps. She was accurate with weapons. She absorbed tactical doctrine with the ease of someone who had already been applying it instinctively. But what stood out most in her training reports was her attitude. Other agents were somber. They understood the deadly work ahead. They were volunteers accepting necessary danger. Nancy was different. Nancy was focused with intensity that instructors recognized as personal. She was not fighting for ideology or nation. She was fighting for revenge. And that made her more dangerous than a dozen patriotic volunteers because revenge does not tire. Revenge does not question. Revenge does not stop until the debt is paid in full. On the night of February 29, 1944, Nancy Wake parachuted back into France. She landed in the Auvergne region of central France, 400 kilometers from where she had operated before. She was now Captain Nancy Wake of the Special Operations Executive. Her mission was to coordinate Maquis resistance forces in preparation for the Allied invasion everyone knew was coming. She carried false papers identifying her as Madame André. She carried a Sten gun, a pistol, a knife, and enough gold coins sewn into her clothing to fund a small army. She landed in a field southeast of Montluçon at 0200 hours. Her parachute drop was perfect. She gathered her equipment and moved toward the reception committee. shapes in darkness, men with weapons, British voices giving quiet orders. Her partner on the mission was Captain John Farmer, a fellow SOE operative. He greeted her with relief. "Thought you might change your mind." "Not bloody likely," Nancy said. The operation was active. The resistance was waiting. The Germans controlled every major road and rail line in central France, and Nancy Wake had come home to make them regret it. The campaign that followed would establish Nancy as something more than a spy or escape line operator. She became a warrior, and the Maquis, those hardened fighters who had been resisting for years, would learn to follow orders from a woman who fought harder than any man they had known. The Maquis forces in Auvergne numbered roughly 7,000 fighters on paper. In reality, they were poorly organized guerrilla bands with minimal equipment and no central command. Many had rifles from the First World War. Some had shotguns. A few had pistols taken from dead German soldiers. They lacked ammunition, explosives, medical supplies, and radio equipment. What they had in abundance was rage and desperation, and the understanding that dying while fighting was better than dying on their knees. Nancy's job was to transform them from scattered resistance into an effective force that could support the Allied invasion. She began with supply drops. Using coded radio transmissions to London, she coordinated parachute deliveries of weapons, ammunition, and explosives. The drops happened at night in remote fields. Nancy personally oversaw each operation, ensuring supplies reached the right units based on tactical need rather than personal loyalty or politics. Maquis leaders, men who had been fighting while she was still in England, initially resented taking orders from a woman. Nancy dealt with their resistance directly. At one supply distribution in March, a Maquis commander named Laurent openly questioned her authority. He suggested that perhaps the British did not understand how resistance worked in France. Perhaps decisions should be made by men who had been fighting longer. Nancy walked up to him and knocked him unconscious with a single punch. When he regained consciousness, she was distributing ammunition. She looked at him once. "Any other questions?" There were no other questions. She had learned hand-to-hand combat from SOE instructors who had trained commandos for raids on occupied Europe. She applied those skills with precision that left no doubt about her capabilities. The Maquis learned quickly that the British woman was not there for advice. She was there to coordinate, and she would do so by force if necessary. The Maquis began conducting raids against German positions under Nancy's coordination. She led many of them personally because leadership from the rear was not her style. On March 15, 1944, her unit ambushed a German convoy near Chaudes-Aigues. The convoy consisted of 3 trucks carrying ammunition and supplies for Wehrmacht positions. Nancy positioned her fighters on high ground overlooking a narrow valley road. Classic ambush doctrine. Simple, effective. The convoy had no reason to expect attack in a region the Germans considered pacified. When the convoy entered the kill zone, the Maquis opened fire with British Sten guns and captured German weapons. The lead truck exploded, ammunition cooking off inside with a roar that echoed off hillsides. German soldiers scrambled for cover, but found themselves trapped between the road and steep terrain. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. Disciplined fire, tactical positioning. The Germans never established effective defense. 23 German soldiers died. The Maquis suffered 2 wounded. Nancy personally shot 3 Germans attempting to establish a defensive position behind the burning truck. Her marksmanship was exceptional. Shots to center mass, professional, clean. This was not the woman who had flirted at checkpoints in Marseille. This was someone else, someone the war had created. German command noted the engagement in their reports. They noted the ambush showed military training. They noted that resistance forces in Auvergne were operating with professionalism that suggested regular military coordination. They were hunting for a British commando. They still had not considered that the coordinator might be a woman. On April 2nd, Nancy's unit destroyed a railway bridge outside Montluçon. The bridge carried German supplies south toward defensive positions, being prepared against the anticipated Allied invasion. Nancy led a team of 12 fighters. They moved through darkness, carrying 40 pounds of plastic explosives each. German sentries guarded both ends of the bridge, standard security procedure. Nancy and 2 Maquis fighters approached the southern sentry post from downstream. They moved through the river, water cold enough to numb extremities, moving slowly to avoid splashing sounds. The sentries heard nothing. They were watching the approaches, not the river. Nancy climbed from the water and approached from behind. She killed the first sentry with her knife, the blade entering beneath his jaw and angling upward into his brain. The second sentry turned at the sound of his partner falling. Nancy shot him once in the chest with her silenced pistol. The suppressor was not Hollywood silent, but quiet enough. Her team placed explosives on the bridge supports. They withdrew to safe distance. The charges detonated at 02:45 hours. The bridge collapsed into the river with a sound like thunder. German engineers would take 17 days to restore rail traffic. During those 17 days, supply shipments to German defensive positions were delayed or rerouted through longer routes that consumed fuel and time. Some historians argue that this single act of sabotage contributed to weaken German ability to reinforce Normandy defenses after D-Day. Nancy did not think in those terms. She thought in terms of Germans killed and German plans disrupted. Strategy was for officers in London. Tactics were her concern. The Gestapo intensified their search. They knew a British agent was operating in Auvergne. They knew this agent was coordinating resistance that was inflicting unacceptable casualties. Radio intercepts suggested the agent used the call sign Hélène. Gestapo files described this person as extremely dangerous, possibly male, possibly a British commando with extensive combat experience. They did not consider that Hélène might be the same person as the white mouse they had hunted in Marseille. Their files were separate. Their operations were uncoordinated. Bureaucracy was saving Nancy's life. They conducted raids against suspected safe houses. They interrogated villagers. They executed anyone suspected of aiding the resistance. The Maquis lost fighters to betrayal and capture. But Nancy's operational security remained absolute. She used dead drops for messages. She changed locations constantly. She trusted no one completely except her radio operator and her immediate command staff. In late April, a crisis emerged that would test everything Nancy had learned. A German unit, roughly 250 soldiers with armor support, had established a forward operating base near Chaude Aiguë. From this position, they were conducting aggressive patrols designed to locate and destroy Maquis camps. Nancy's forces were in danger of being surrounded and destroyed in detail. Standard guerrilla doctrine called for dispersal. Avoid direct confrontation with superior forces. Melt back into civilian population. Wait for better opportunities. Nancy rejected this approach. She gathered intelligence on the German position. She studied their patrol patterns for 5 days. She identified their weak points. Discipline was good, but not perfect. Guards changed shifts at predictable times. Officers were confident, which meant they were careless. The base was positioned for offense, not defense. Then she planned an attack that her staff considered suicidal. Her senior Maquis commanders argued against it. The Germans had numerical superiority. They had armor. They had fortified positions. An assault would be suicide. Nancy listened to their concerns. Then she explained that allowing the Germans to continue operations from this base was also suicide. Slower, but certain. They could disperse and survive another month. Then the Germans would find them again. Or they could attack now and eliminate the threat. "We're not dispersing," Nancy said. "We're attacking. Brief your units." On the night of May 7th, Nancy led a force of 150 Maquis fighters in a coordinated assault on the German position. The attack began at 0300 hours with a diversionary force engaging German sentries on the eastern perimeter. Sustained fire, visible muzzle flashes, loud. The Germans oriented their defenses toward the threat. While German forces concentrated on the diversion, Nancy led the main assault from the west. Her fighters moved through forest in complete darkness. No lights, no talking. They were within 50 meters of German positions before they were detected. The firefight was close and brutal. Nancy moved through the combat with methodical violence. She directed fire teams. She eliminated German soldiers who attempted to organize defenses. She personally destroyed a machine gun position that threatened to break the Maquis assault, using grenades with precision that came from training and from not caring whether she survived the next 5 minutes. German commanders ordered retreat after 40 minutes of fighting. They had expected guerrillas to scatter under disciplined fire. Instead, they faced an organized assault with coordinated elements and aggressive tactics that matched their own training. The Maquis killed 68 Germans and captured 32. Nancy's forces suffered 14 dead and 23 wounded. Nancy remained in the field until all wounded were evacuated to a makeshift aid station. She did not sleep for 36 hours. She wrote letters to the families of the dead. She did not know if the letters would reach them. She wrote them anyway. German reports after the engagement noted that resistance forces in Auvergne were operating with professionalism that suggested they were being coordinated by a highly trained operative. They upgraded their assessment of the threat. They sent additional troops. They increased air reconnaissance. They were hunting an enemy they could not understand because they refused to accept that a woman was orchestrating their defeats. Nancy Wake was not on their list of possibilities. Their own assumptions were killing them. The most famous incident of Nancy's combat service occurred in June 1944. Accounts vary on exact details, but SOE records and Nancy's own later testimony confirm the essentials. Nancy encountered a German sentry during a reconnaissance mission near Montluçon. She was scouting German positions in preparation for a sabotage operation. The sentry spotted her before she could withdraw. She was armed, but firing would alert nearby German positions and compromise the operation. The sentry advanced, rifle raised, shouting for her to halt. Nancy closed the distance between them with speed that caught him off guard. She used a technique taught by SOE instructors, a judo-based method for disabling armed opponents at close range. She deflected his rifle with her left arm, struck his throat with her right hand to collapse his windpipe, and killed him with her bare hands in less than 20 seconds. The method was brutal and effective. Nancy later told interviewers that she did not feel pride about the kill. She felt nothing. The sentry was an obstacle. She removed him. The war had burned away any romanticism about combat. What remained was pure function. Germans were targets. Targets were eliminated. This was the mathematics of survival. By late June, Nancy's Maquis units had killed over 200 German soldiers and destroyed significant German equipment and infrastructure, railways, bridges, supply depots, communications lines. German command designated Auvergne as a high-priority region for pacification. They conducted reprisal operations against civilian villages suspected of supporting the resistance. Innocent people died because of operations Nancy coordinated. She understood this. She accepted it. The calculations of war do not offer clean choices. Every German killed potentially saved Allied soldiers during the invasion. Every bridge destroyed shortened the war. Every supply convoy ambushed weakened German defensive capacity. The cost in French civilian lives was real and terrible and necessary. Nancy carried that cost. She never claimed the burden made her heroic. She claimed only that it made her effective. And effectiveness was the only metric that mattered when the alternative was German occupation, continuing indefinitely. Perhaps the most physically demanding operation Nancy completed was the bicycle mission. In late June, her radio operator was captured during a German raid on a safe house. Without radio contact, Nancy could not coordinate supply drops or relay intelligence to London. She needed to reach another SOE team operating near Saint-Santin, roughly 500 kilometers away through mountainous terrain. No vehicles were available. German checkpoints covered all major roads. Nancy made the journey by bicycle. She departed on June 29th and rode through terrain that would challenge experienced cyclists. She cycled through darkness to avoid German patrols. Her hands blistered and bled from gripping the handlebars, her legs cramped. She pushed the bicycle up mountain passes and descended through switchbacks in darkness without lights, navigating by memory and instinct. She cycled for 71 hours with minimal rest. She ate whatever she could find. She slept for 2 hours at a time in barns and forests. She reached Saint-Santin on July 2nd. She delivered her intelligence. She arranged for a new radio operator. She cycled back to Auvergne, arriving on July 5th. She had covered approximately 1,000 kilometers in 7 days. When her commanders in London learned of the journey through radio reports, they could barely believe it. Nancy dismissed their amazement. The mission required completion. She completed it. That was the beginning and end of the story. The operations continued through summer 1944. Nancy's Maquis forces grew to over 7,000 organized fighters under her coordination. They conducted raids, ambushes, and sabotage operations that tied down German units desperately needed elsewhere. As Allied forces broke out from Normandy in August, Nancy's fighters prevented German reinforcements from moving north. They destroyed bridges. They blocked roads. They attacked supply lines with coordination that made German logistics a nightmare. German commanders in the region requested additional troops to deal with what they described as a well-trained insurgent army. Those troops were not available. The Wehrmacht was collapsing on multiple fronts. Nancy's war in Auvergne was a small part of a vast conflict, but it was not an insignificant part. Every German soldier killed in Auvergne was a soldier who could not fight in Normandy. Every hour German commanders spent dealing with resistance was an hour they could not spend coordinating defense. Nancy understood that wars are won by accumulation of small victories. She accumulated them methodically, but victories have costs, and Nancy's cost would be paid in full. In March 1944, before the operations in Auvergne had truly intensified, before Nancy had parachuted back into France, she received news that would define everything that followed. A coded message from London contained information gathered by intelligence sources still operating in France. The message was brief, professional, emotionless in the way intelligence reports are emotionless when they contain information that will destroy someone. Henri Fiocca had been arrested by the Gestapo in October 1943. He had been held at their headquarters in Marseille. He had been interrogated for 6 days. He had been tortured using methods detailed in Gestapo training manuals, methods designed to extract information while keeping prisoners alive long enough to verify that information. Henri had revealed nothing about Nancy's activities, nothing about her network, nothing about safe houses or contacts or operational procedures. He had endured torture that broke trained operatives and revealed nothing. On October 15, 1943, the Gestapo executed him. They shot him in the courtyard of their headquarters. His crime was being married to the White Mouse. His death was intended as a message. If the Germans could not capture Nancy Wake, they would make her pay by destroying everyone connected to her. Nancy was in England when she learned this. She was in the middle of SOE training at a facility in Scotland. She received the message in her dormitory late at night. She read it once. She folded the paper carefully and placed it in her pocket. She did not cry. She did not scream. She walked to the training armory and requested permission to use the shooting range. The instructor, a veteran sergeant named MacLeod, who had seen men break under far less, granted permission without question. Nancy fired at targets until dawn. Her accuracy was exceptional. Every shot sent her mass, every target destroyed. When she finally stopped, her hands were steady. The instructor asked if she was all right. Nancy looked at him with eyes that held nothing human. She said she was fine. She said she wanted to return to France as soon as possible. MacLeod filed a report noting that Captain Wake had received difficult personal news and was coping with exceptional composure. The report did not capture what was truly happening. Nancy was not coping. She was transforming. The woman who had fought for escape lines and resistance coordination was being replaced by something harder. Grief was fuel. Henry's death was not a tragedy to mourn. It was a debt to repay. And Nancy intended to repay it with interest calculated in German corpses. When Nancy parachuted into France 2 months later, she carried Henri's death with her like ammunition. Every German she killed for him. Every operation she planned knowing that the man she loved had died, rather than betray her. The Gestapo had intended Henri's execution as leverage, as a demonstration of consequences for resistance. They did not understand that they had instead removed the one anchor that might have made Nancy cautious. She had nothing left to lose. That made her more dangerous than any trained operative in occupied France, because trained operatives still feared death, still had futures they wanted to reach, still had people waiting for them. Nancy had already experienced the only loss that mattered. Everything after Henri was borrowed time, and she intended to spend that time making the Germans regret killing him. The resistance fighters who served under Nancy in Auvergne noticed a quality in her that was different from other British agents. She was not cruel. She did not take pleasure in killing, but she had a relentlessness that was almost mechanical. She did not hesitate. She did not question whether a target should die. If German soldiers occupied a position, she planned to remove them. If a bridge carried German supplies, she planned to destroy it. If an informer betrayed the resistance, she ensured they were dealt with permanently. Her Maquis commanders later described her as the best combat leader they had served under, not because she was the most skilled tactically. There were Maquis leaders with more combat experience. Not because she was the bravest. Bravery was common among men who had chosen resistance over submission, but because she was the most committed. She fought the way people fight when the outcome of the war matters less than the certainty of enemy casualties. She fought like someone with nothing to lose and everything to avenge. In interviews decades later, Nancy would sometimes discuss Henri. She would say he was the kindest man she had ever known. She would say he deserved better than her. She would say that the war took everything from both of them, but at least she got to fight back. Henri had died without that consolation. She lived with that knowledge for 68 years. Some losses do not heal, they simply become part of the structure of who you are. Nancy carried Henri's death the way soldiers carry shrapnel too close to vital organs to remove. It was with her always. It shaped how she moved through the world, and it meant that every German soldier who died in Auvergne died not just because of military necessity, but because Nancy Wake had decided that the debt owed for Henri Fiocca's life would be paid in full. The Gestapo had killed him to send a message. Nancy received that message, and she sent her own reply written in German blood across the hills of central France. By August 1944, Allied forces had liberated much of France. Paris fell on August 25th. German units everywhere were in full retreat or surrender. The war in Nancy's region was effectively over. Her Maquis forces had accomplished their mission. They had disrupted German logistics. They had prevented reinforcements from reaching Normandy. They had killed over 200 German soldiers and destroyed infrastructure worth millions of Reichsmarks. SOE Command ordered Nancy to return to London for debriefing. She arrived in September to a city preparing for victory. People spoke of Germany's inevitable defeat with certainty that would have seemed impossible 4 years earlier. London was celebrating. Nancy felt nothing. She had accomplished what she came to do. She had killed Germans. She had disrupted their operations. She had made them pay. But Henri was still dead. Victory did not change that. The British government awarded Nancy the George Medal for gallantry. France awarded her the Croix de Guerre with 2 palms and a star. The United States awarded her the Medal of Freedom. These were among the highest honors each nation could bestow on someone who was not a citizen. She received them at ceremonies in London and Paris. She wore her uniform. She stood at attention. She accepted the medals with appropriate humility. She felt like a fraud. The medals were for Captain Nancy Wake, SOE operative, resistance coordinator, hero. The woman inside the uniform was simply someone who had survived while better people died. Henri had died. Maquis fighters had died. Civilians had been executed in reprisals. The war had taken millions, and she was receiving medals because she had been lucky and ruthless and effective. She accepted the medals because refusing them would dishonor the people she had fought alongside, but she did not keep them on display. They went into a drawer. She did not look at them for years. After the war, Nancy returned to Australia briefly. She could not settle. Everything felt wrong. The normalcy of civilian life felt obscene after what she had seen and done. She moved back to London. She worked for British intelligence in various capacities, none of which she could discuss. She drank more than she should. She had nightmares about checkpoints and interrogations and the sound Henri's voice made when he said her name. In 1957, she married John Forward, an RAF officer. The marriage was good. John understood that Nancy carried weight she could not share. He did not ask questions about the war. He accepted the nightmares and the drinking and the moments when she seemed to be somewhere else entirely. The marriage lasted until his death in 1997, 40 years of stability that Nancy later said saved her life. She gave interviews about the war when requested. She was honest about what she had done. She did not romanticize resistance work. She described it as frightening and necessary. She said the Gestapo was efficient and brutal. She said good people died for no reason, except being in the wrong place. She said she got lucky more than she got clever. She deflected praise with the skill of someone who had spent years deflecting suspicion. Historians would calculate Nancy's achievements in precise terms. She personally coordinated operations that killed or captured over 200 German soldiers. She led Maquis forces numbering 7,000 fighters. She survived 4 years of Gestapo pursuit across 2 operations, Marseille and Auvergne. She completed one of the most physically demanding missions of the war with the bicycle ride to Saint-Saëns. She was the Gestapo's most wanted person in France with a 5 million franc bounty. She parachuted behind enemy lines when most SOE operatives were being captured within months. She did all of this starting as an untrained civilian with nothing but courage and intelligence. By any measure, Nancy Wake was one of the most effective Allied operatives of the Second World War. But Nancy herself rejected the hero narrative. In a 2001 interview, at age 89, she was asked if she felt proud of her war service. She thought for a long time before answering. "I'm proud of the people I served with, the French people who risked everything, the Maquis who fought when they could have fled. I'm not proud of myself. Pride isn't relevant. I did what needed doing. Killing was necessary but not admirable. The people who deserve admiration are the ones who died rather than collaborate, the ones who protected strangers at risk to their families, the ones who maintained humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it." She paused. "I was practical. The Germans invaded my adopted country. They killed my husband. Fighting back wasn't heroism. It was arithmetic." Nancy Wake died on August 7, 2011, in London. She was 98 years old. She had requested that her ashes be scattered in the hills of Auvergne, where she had fought alongside the Maquis. Her family honored that request. A small group traveled to France. They scattered her ashes near Montluçon, on a hillside overlooking valleys where German convoys had burned 70 years earlier. Her memorial service in London was attended by veterans, historians, and members of the French resistance who remembered a woman who had led them through the darkest period of their nation's history. The French government sent representatives. The British government sent representatives. Australia claimed her as a national hero. New Zealand claimed her as well. Newspapers ran obituaries describing her as one of the greatest heroines of World War II. Nancy would have found all the attention excessive. She had said repeatedly that she was not special. She was simply someone who refused to accept that occupation was permanent, that ordinary people could not fight back, that evil could win without being challenged. The Gestapo had called her the White Mouse. The French called her a hero. Nancy called herself a woman who got angry and stayed angry until the war ended. Her final statistics are these. Over 1,000 Allied personnel smuggled to safety before her own escape became necessary. Over 200 German soldiers killed in direct combat or operations she commanded. 7,000 Maquis fighters coordinated during the liberation of Auvergne. Countless intelligence reports that contributed to Allied planning. A 5 million franc bounty that was never collected because the Gestapo could never hold her long enough to confirm her identity. She was captured 0 times. She escaped 11 Gestapo raids in Marseille. She completed her war without serious injury, despite 4 years of the most dangerous work an operative could undertake. By any objective measure, Nancy Wake's record stands among the most remarkable of the entire war. The Germans hunted her with obsessive determination. They never caught her. They barely came close. She moved through occupied France the way fog moves through valleys, visible only when she chose to be, gone before they could close their hands around her. The White Mouse was not just uncatchable, she was inevitable. Every checkpoint she passed, every operation she completed, every German soldier she killed was a demonstration that occupation could be resisted, that ordinary people with courage and intelligence could become something the Wehrmacht feared, that one woman with charm and a pistol and absolute commitment could make the Gestapo look incompetent. The war ended, the medals were awarded, the stories were documented. But for Nancy, the cost never changed. Henry Fiocca died in 1943. Nancy died in 2011. For 68 years, she lived with the knowledge that the man she loved had been tortured and executed because she had chosen to fight. She never expressed regret about that choice, but she never pretended it did not cost everything. Some victories are purchased with pieces of yourself you cannot recover. Nancy paid that price. She paid it knowing exactly what it would cost, and she considered it worth paying. Not because she was heroic, but because she was practical. The Gestapo was evil. Henry was dead. Killing Germans would not bring him back, but it would ensure his death had meaning. That mathematics, brutal and true, guided Nancy through the war and through the decades that followed. She was not a hero in the way stories prefer. She was something more real. She was someone who chose to fight when fighting seemed impossible and who paid for that choice with everything she valued. And she never once suggested that history owed her gratitude for making that choice. She simply said that someone had to do it, and she happened to be there, and she happened to be good at it, and that was all. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters, each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.